We are at the Hoover Institution in Stanford University. This is one of the great scholarly resources in the United States. It's named after American President Herbert Hoover, and the institution itself is sort of a conservative think tank. But over the years, many Republican and conservative figures and other people have donated their papers here. And so the archives are particularly rich for scholars and biographers.
So why are we here today?
We're here because I'm writing a biography of Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, the youngest of the three Kennedy brothers who participated in American politics in the 20th century. President John Kennedy, Senator Robert Kennedy, and then the third and the youngest of the boys in the family was Senator Edward Kennedy, also known as Ted or Teddy. And there is a collection here left to the Hoover Institution by their father's biographer. Their father's name was Joseph P. Kennedy, and he was at one time one of the richest men in the United States, and a journalist and biographer and sometime Republican speechwriter named Richard Whalen wrote a biography of Joe Kennedy called The Founding Father. And Richard Whalen's papers were left to the Hoover Institution. I came across them when I was working on a book on Richard Nixon here. He also wrote 2 books about Richard Nixon, so I'm sort of familiar with what's here, but I don't know what's actually in the Joseph Kennedy boxes. So there's a chance that we'll be finding excellent gold or just a bunch of media clips that won't help me very much at all.
And so who was Edward Kennedy? What is he well known for?
He's well known for 2 things. His career was over 40 years in the United States Senate. By the time he died, he was known as the Lion of the Senate. He was one of the great liberal voices all through that time. He ran for president in 1980, challenged President Jimmy Carter in the Democratic primaries, and in doing so helped soften up the Democratic Party and Carter. And Ronald Reagan was elected that fall instead of Carter for a second term. He's also known, Teddy is also known for the automobile accident on Chappaquiddick Island in 1969, in which a young woman named Mary Jo Kopechne was drowned. She and Ted were leaving a party late at night. He took a wrong turn, drove over a bridge, the car flipped over. He escaped from the car, and she did not. It's an automobile accident, but the controversy has been over the years that he didn't report the accident for another 10 hours. And so he was actually found guilty of negligent, reckless driving, sentenced to 2 months in jail, but it was suspended. He then went on television, made a plea to the voters of Massachusetts to keep his job, and he was re-elected overwhelmingly the next time he ran, which was in 1970.
Can you tell me a little bit about Richard Whalen and what kind of items you hope to find in these boxes?
Sure. Richard Whalen was a New York journalist, magazine journalist. He spent some time, I believe, working for Fortune magazine. And he was also a liberal Republican, and he got caught up in the Nixon campaign, Richard Nixon's presidential campaign in 1968 as a speechwriter, and it did not go well. He clashed with some of the other aides and left the campaign and ended up writing 2 books about Republican politics in the late 1960s. That's what brought me here last time. Because he had that business background, he also was very interested, and because he worked for Richard Nixon, who famously lost to Jack Kennedy in 1960, he also had an interest in the Kennedys, and especially in Joseph Kennedy. So what I'm hoping to find here are excerpts from his research, original documents that can't be found elsewhere, but I'm especially looking, hopefully, to find transcripts of the interviews that he did for his book, because those people are obviously long dead. They were contemporaries of Joe Kennedy, who died in 1969.
Could you walk us through that process?
Sure.
Yeah.
Pull out a box and show you? Yeah. So I come to an institution like the Hoover Institution, ask for the boxes that I want to see. They come out on a little cart and take one at a time, because these are fragile records. But in addition to being fragile, you also don't want to misfile. You don't want to, by mistake, put something that another scholar is expecting to find in this box in another box where it'll be lost. So shall we do some treasure hunting?
Yeah, let's go dig it.
So let's see what we got here. So as I said, Joseph Kennedy was John F. Kennedy, Ted Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy's dad. Mm-hmm. A controversial figure because he made lots of money on Wall Street right before the crash of 1929. He was one of the pioneering tycoons out in Hollywood. He was rumored to have been a bootlegger during Prohibition, and he was always a lone wolf. The flip side of that was that Franklin Roosevelt needed somebody after the stock market crash to head up the new regulatory commission called the Securities and Exchange Commission. And so he had the brilliant idea of taking a fox and putting a fox among the foxes. And so he selected Joseph Kennedy, and much of our securities regulation today is based on the work that Kennedy did, setting up the Securities and Exchange Commission back then. So, and he was also ambassador to Great Britain, the first, if I'm not correct, if I'm not incorrect, he was the first Catholic, and definitely the first Irish Catholic ambassador to Great Britain. And there's a famous scene in his wife's memoir, where, having arrived there from these two Irish Catholic families in Boston and been invited to Windsor Castle and gone up to see this amazing bedroom where they're waiting, changing into clothes to go down and meet the king and queen, and he turns to his wife and he smiles and says, "It's a long way from East Boston, isn't it, Rosie?" Which sort of captures the spirit of him. He was sort of a bit of a pirate, very proud and driven man, and also someone who was renowned for his extramarital affairs. In Hollywood in particular, he had a long-lasting, notorious affair with Gloria Swanson, who was a famous film actress at the time. So that's basically what we're looking for, is things especially about his children. Teddy was the youngest, but you can find patterns in how he raised the other children. So, also he was a very controversial figure because he had these 9 kids, and he was terrified that they would be lost in a stupid war. And so he identified World War II as that kind of catastrophe that he said once, he said, "I have 9 hostages to fortune," meaning his children. And he didn't want any of them lost because America got involved in a European war. So after the war breaks out, and before the war breaks out, but especially after the war breaks out in Europe in 1939, Joseph Kennedy is a voice against American involvement. And this puts him at odds with Franklin Roosevelt, the man who appointed him as ambassador. And it also has left him down through the ages as with the I don't know what reputation. It has also left him down through the ages with the reputation as an appeaser, as a follower of appeasement with Adolf Hitler and Mussolini. Particularly given what happened with the Holocaust and the concentration camps and what happened to the Jews in Europe. This is one of the major black marks against him. And it was said that part of the reason that his 2 eldest sons went to war and volunteered for dangerous duty, one of them in Navy aviation, who was lost, and the other, John F. Kennedy, with PT boats in South Pacific, who underwent an ordeal, after his boat was rammed by a Japanese destroyer, that one of the things they were trying to do was remove the stain of appeasement from the Kennedy name. So here's the first file, and FDR, Jews, 1938. So Richard Whalen, back when he's writing this book in the 1960s, is obviously looking at just exactly what was Kennedy's position on appeasement, and especially the fate of the European Jews under Hitler. And here's a folder, file number 24, of Joseph Kennedy as ambassador to Great Britain, the American ambassador to Great Britain at the time of the rise of Adolf Hitler, and a time when Joseph Kennedy, desperate to keep the United States out of war, was recommending to the American and British governments that both of them try to strike a deal with Hitler rather than face him down. There were two famous English prime ministers at the time that Joe Kennedy was there. The first one was Neville Chamberlain, who was an appeaser and actually went and tried to cut a deal with Hitler. And he was very close friends with Joseph Kennedy. And he was succeeded by Winston Churchill, who was no appeaser at all and did not get along well with Joe Kennedy, and ended up taking Britain into war and being a rock of strength for democracy and for civilization, really, when you think about what Hitlerism stood for. So this is a folder that is marked Kennedy's anti-war campaign. There are several intriguing things. J.P. Kennedy letters to Barnes, don't know who Barnes is. Arthur Krock memo. Arthur Krock was the New York Times bureau chief in Washington and a close friend of Joseph Kennedy. And then Joan Whalen research, I guess that was his wife, was his researcher. So here we start off with a memo from Arthur Krock to Richard Whalen. And Arthur Krock was a friend of Kennedy, and also as a newsman had to cover him. And it says at the top, confidential, musings of Senator Neil McLean of New Brunswick during visit to our office in 1966. And it says, in recalling incident about Joseph P. Kennedy. And so Arthur Krock, as a good newsman, had interviewed Senator Neil McLean, who had told him this story about Joseph Kennedy. Both my brother and Mr. Robinson were extremely friendly towards Franklin Roosevelt, who over the years had spent much time in New Brunswick. When my brother and Mr. Robinson, don't know who Mr. Robinson is yet, came home to St. John's, they were understandably upset over conversations they had had with employees and nurses at the clinic, who reported that Mr. Kennedy was doing a lot of talking against President Roosevelt and saying he must be stopped from getting the United States into war. Hitler, Kennedy reportedly said, was already master of Europe, and the United States should simply try to make the best peace possible. Mr. Kennedy, who had extensive interests and investments in Hollywood, had said he was going to see about having a stop put to some of the propaganda pictures then being made depicting Hitler's cruelty to Jews. So that's a private confidential memo from a United States senator to the New York Times bureau chief in Washington that gives credence to the view that Joseph Kennedy, if he wasn't anti-Semitic, at least felt that the plight of the Jews was not worth going to war and taking Hitler on in 1939 and 1940. So what does this have to do with Edward Kennedy? Is that throughout his years in office, throughout all of the son's years in office, you find this steady migration away from this appeasement type point of view, this conservative businessman's point of view, this sort of selfish point of view, towards a more liberal theology. You find first Jack Kennedy becomes elected president, and he begins to push for things like civil rights and Medicare. Doesn't get them through. He's assassinated, and Lyndon Johnson, his successor, manages to push them through. the Senate with both Robert Kennedy and Ted Kennedy in the Senate. You find Robert Kennedy then in 1968 becoming even more liberal and running against Lyndon Johnson for president. And then you find Ted Kennedy in 1979 challenging the more conservative Jimmy Carter and going on to becoming the great liberal lion of the Senate, passing legislation on health care, on civil rights, on AIDS, on Title IX and women's rights, on a host of issues that matter to families trying to get through the day. So this is an example of where the Kennedys began. Ted Kennedy's career is where the Kennedy influence ended up, and it's a far different place. Ted Kennedy was much more of an internationalist. You'd never hear him saying something like this about an underdog group in the United States. He was a champion for the underdog.
So in going through all these files and folders, what percentage are, in your mind, winners? I guess what's the ratio of winners to, I think as you put it, dry holes?
Yeah, I would say probably, probably 1 in 100. On a good day, I will have gone through maybe a dozen of these boxes and come across 1 or 2 pieces of paper that at the end of the day I walk home with a smile on my face. But if you figure that a book is 600 pages, and there's a lot of standard stuff you just got to get in there, who his parents were, when he was born, where he went to school, what he was like as a young man, what bills he sponsored in Congress, what were his communications with his brothers. That fills up, just the basic chronology of a story fills up a large part of the book. And so what you're looking for are intriguing, revealing anecdotes like this one that cast light in a new way on the figures in the book. And if you can only find 1 or 2 a day, and you do research of 100 days a year over 4 years, that's still 400 nice nuggets to slip into the book here and there to make it more lively.
So speaking of these nuggets, throughout all your research so far, do you have any favorite Kennedy nuggets of the Kennedy family or Teddy in particular that you've come across in maybe here or other archives?
So it's not a world burner or something that's going to cause headlines tomorrow. But I just recently came across a story that shows Ted Kennedy's sense of humor. And like I said, he had sort of an impish and playful sense of humor. And when he was a young senator, he had been defeated in a race for Democratic whip by Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia. And Senator Robert Byrd was everything that Ted Kennedy was not. He was a Protestant. He was from West Virginia, from a family that was very, very poor. And he always carried sort of a feeling of grievance about him against the rich boys in the Senate. He was very happy to beat Ted Kennedy for the whip's position. And he did it by being almost servile to the other senators, coming to them and doing little modest favors that made their life a little bit easier. In the end, at the end of their careers, they became very close friends because they both were liberal Democrats at heart. But for a while there, the relationship was sort of rocky. There was another senator who was in the chamber, and Ted decided that he would play a practical joke on this senator, and he called him over and he said, Bob Byrd's dog just died, and you probably could score some points if you went over to him and just said how sorry you were that you lost his dog. He was very devoted to it. The dog's name was Trixie. And so the senator said, "Oh, thanks a lot, Ted. Thanks a lot." And so he went over and he talked to Bob Byrd, and 5 minutes later he came storming back across the Senate floor, steam coming out of his ears, and Ted Kennedy was sitting there holding his sides because Trixie was not the name of Bob Byrd's dogs. Trixie was the name of Bob Byrd's daughter, and this other senator had gone over there and spent the entire time putting his arm around Bob Byrd, saying how sad he was to hear that Trixie had gone. She was such a beautiful animal, and he felt so bad about it. So I'm not sure that the name was Trixie. It's one of those stories that I'm going to have to find the senator in question and nail down. But it's a good example of the kind of practical jokes that Teddy liked to play. And I came across that one very much like this, going through an archive, going through a folder and turning every page.
Perfect, thank you. Is that going to make the book?
If I can confirm it. That's got to be confirmed. The senator who's still alive may not want to confirm it, may say that, you know, it's an apocryphal story, it never actually happened that way. Could be that Bob Byrd never had a daughter named Trixie, but I'll have to nail it down. But it's a great story because it captures Teddy's personality, sort of that impish sense of humor that he had.
So when looking at your previous biography figures and looking forward to Teddy Kennedy, what's your goal when putting these biographies together?
Well, the most practical goal is to make a living, which means that it has to have a certain commercial appeal. It has to be an enjoyable experience. I always think that my books would be a failure if you couldn't take them to the beach. I mean, they should be something that you read on vacation for the pleasure of learning something, and it shouldn't be bitter medicine that you take because you have to learn something. So that's right off the bat. You also have the you know, your reputation as a scholar and as a historian. Particularly, I came from journalism. There's a lot of biographers who come from journalistic backgrounds, and those in the academic community, like here at Stanford, are slightly more skeptical. You have a slightly bigger hurdle that you have to leap if you're not trained in academic historian, if you don't have a PhD. So that's something I try to keep in mind as well. And I'm always looking, I guess this is the old reporter in me, for something that's along the lines of a scoop. In the Nixon book, I was able to find an important piece of the puzzle about Nixon and Vietnam, and I would like to be able to say that there's something in all these books that even somebody who's read 2 or 3 books about the Kennedys still will come to and say, oh, didn't know that before. That's interesting. That tells me something about our history and where we came from.
So as an author, what do you want your readership to know about the book making process?
We're in a time now where little snippets and witticisms that pass for wisdom get thrown around, and I'm a great Twitter user myself, so I understand the attraction. But there is no substitute for truth and for scientific truth and for reasoned argument rather than you know, knee-jerk glandular debate. And so one thing that, you know, I'm always cheered to see is that the market for good biography, the market for good history is still there, that Americans still devour these big, thick books about their history, trying to come to terms with what it means. How did people in these past days get through crises like the ones that we face today? There is such a thing as objective truth. Historians and scientists struggle for it all the time. We couldn't have gone to the moon if there wasn't mathematical and scientific proofs that governed the ability of that spaceship to go to our satellite, to land, and then and come back. So when you hear about scientists being ridiculed for their warnings about global warming, or when politicians try to rewrite history to advance their own interests or careers, it's reassuring, I think, makes my job more rewarding to know that Americans still have that old basis of facts in, you know, like the Wright brothers, in, you know, figuring out what an objective truth is and then acting on it. And that's what historians try to do, is go through all this stuff and put in as an appealing a story as possible the truths of what they find in our history.